The galactic map shimmered with growing unrest. What had once been a stable union of allied species under the Galactic Empire was fracturing. Fringe systems had begun to rebel, alliances were shifting, and war was no longer a question of if, but when. In the core chamber of the Imperial War Council, where cold metal met the hush of ancient authority, the strategists gathered. A decision had to be made: either crush the uprising swiftly by consolidating every available ally, or risk a prolonged civil collapse. It was here that the humans came into discussion. Earth was still considered young in galactic terms. Technologically they were catching up fast, but they were not seen as essential yet. The Empire had previously allowed them observer status, partly out of caution, partly out of curiosity. But now, with war looming, the notion of neutrality was an inconvenience. The dominant voice on the Council, Admiral Sovereign, proposed compulsory conscription of all independent systems, including Earth. Others murmured agreement. The logic seemed sound: more ships, more troops, more reach. But then General Vrel stood. Vrel was not given to sentiment or politics. He had served for nearly 2 centuries, participating in campaigns across a dozen systems. His record was flawless, his loyalty unquestioned. Yet his tone carried warning, not confidence. "Leave the humans out of this," he said with quiet firmness. The room fell into an uneasy silence, not because of the words themselves, but because Vrel rarely voiced opposition. His reasoning wasn't framed in emotion. He simply laid out the facts. They are not essential to this war. Their inclusion brings more risk than reward. Let them remain neutral. That was the summary, but the weight behind it was deeper. Vrel had observed the humans longer than most. While other species showcased evolutionary perfection, biological efficiency, psychic resonance, symbiotic cohesion, humans defied categorization. They were messy, disorganized, driven by emotions and riddled with internal conflict. But somehow, again and again, they endured. Not just endured, they adapted faster than any species recorded. Sovereign leaned forward, mocking in tone. "You believe they pose a threat to the Empire?" The question was half amusement, half challenge. Vrel did not blink. "Not in the way you think. They do not conquer with fleets. They destabilize by existing." He cited archived reports, though sparingly. Small-scale clashes where human captains had turned desperate retreats into tactical traps. Negotiations where their diplomats didn't just barter, they reshaped entire alliances by understanding emotional leverage. In one instance, a species with triple Earth's technological capacity had been driven off their occupied moon by human miners wielding repurposed drilling tools and psychological warfare. No pattern, no doctrine. That was the danger. Predictability had always been the Empire's greatest advantage. With humans, prediction failed. He emphasized a single point: humans do not escalate like other species. They internalize threats, pretend weakness, then retaliate with overwhelming creativity. They think sideways. They do not fear annihilation in the same way. In their own history, they had repeatedly flirted with extinction by their own hand, and survived. Nuclear winter, biological collapse, climate trauma, AI rebellions, they had danced through them all. Not unscathed, but unbroken. Still, the Council wavered. Some nodded in concern, others shook their heads. Letting one species sit out while others bleed sets a dangerous precedent, someone argued. Vrel's response was quiet but sharp. Forcing one species into a war it did not start may end it sooner than you think, but not in the way you hope. It wasn't a threat. It was an observation. His final comment before yielding the floor was chilling in its simplicity. They do not crave war. But if you show up on their doorstep with one, you may not like the version of them that answers. There was no consensus. The Council would vote later. But the seed was planted. Not out of fear of humanity's strength, but fear of its nature. They did not fight to win glory, or expand territory, or impose ideology. They fought because survival was a fire embedded into their bones. And when survival was the only goal, morality, logic, and diplomacy could become optional. Vrel left the chamber without waiting for deliberation. He had done his part. The Empire would act as empires always do, by force, not foresight. Whether they listened to reason no longer mattered. He knew how humans responded when backed into a corner. They didn't surrender. They evolved. The Council reconvened in partial secrecy 3 days after General Vrel's warning. The proposal to conscript Earth remained undecided, but now curiosity had replaced dismissal. To address the unease, Vrel submitted a classified archive. No rhetoric. Just records. The compiled dossier was ancient by human standards but relatively recent to the galactic timeline. He titled it simply, Engagements with Humanity, Anomalous Outcomes. The first file highlighted the Battle of Schuler v. A skirmish by most standards, insignificant in scale, but its results had been unsettling. A rebel fleet had taken refuge in a resource field where humans were conducting mining operations. The Empire authorized a strike, believing the humans would evacuate or remain non-combatants. They did neither. Instead, using outdated mining vessels, orbital debris, and solar flare timing, the humans created an improvised blockade that isolated the rebel fleet. When Empire forces arrived, they found wreckage and silence. No human casualties. No remaining rebels. The exact tactics remained unclear even in post-action simulations. They had no warships, Vrel noted. Only intent. The second entry involved a diplomatic standoff with the Akrathi. A notoriously volatile species, the Akrathi had declared territorial ownership over a sector that Earth planned to colonize. Rather than respond militarily, Earth sent a 3-person diplomatic team. No guards. No warships. Within 48 hours, the Akrathi had not only relinquished claim but agreed to a technology exchange pact. Internal records later leaked by a third-party species suggested the humans had employed psychological models designed not just to negotiate but to manipulate. The Akrathi leader described the humans as possessing no fear of death, yet capable of predicting it with terrifying accuracy. Then came the data on Earth's own timeline, events from their internal history that no other species had parallels for. Their 20th and 21st centuries alone were riddled with anomalies. 2 global wars that reshaped entire continents. A nuclear standoff lasting decades where neither side fired a shot, not out of restraint, but because of something the humans called mutually assured destruction. They built weapons capable of planetary annihilation, then constructed moral frameworks to not use them. They invented artificial intelligence, only to deliberately limit it. They developed chemical and biological weapons, then banned their own use. No species had ever weaponized ethics the way humanity had. Vrel didn't embellish the data. He simply allowed the numbers and outcomes to speak. Repeatedly, humans thrived in volatility. Their technological evolution was not linear, it spiked after disasters. After every major conflict, they emerged more advanced, not less. Their species had no singular world government, yet managed global infrastructure. They disagreed internally on almost everything, yet acted as one when threatened externally. It wasn't unity in the traditional sense. It was instinctual adaptation. The final segment of the archive focused on behavioral unpredictability. In simulations conducted by other empires, human units routinely disrupted control groups. One particular AI-led training scenario, designed to test coordinated fleet behavior, was thrown into chaos when a single human crew altered their objectives mid-simulation. They disregarded the optimal win condition and instead devised a third outcome: total system denial. Not victory, not defeat, just a new paradigm that rendered the simulation obsolete. When questioned, the human captain simply replied, "We didn't like the choices, so we made a better one." That response became a recurring pattern. They often ignored binary conditions. Win or lose? No, humans looked for. Change the game. Conquer or surrender? No, they'd negotiate while sabotaging. Defend or flee? No, they'd ambush, even if it meant their own destruction. It wasn't courage in the traditional sense. It was a rejection of predictable logic. No algorithm could consistently model human behavior. Every species in the database had threat curves, escalation thresholds, emotional saturation points. Humanity alone operated in spikes and lulls, defying even quantum-based prediction models. This made them, by definition, unstable. And in war, instability could become supremacy. The final excerpt in the file included a quote from a Zaltari scientist who'd spent 2 decades studying human conflict behavior. "They are not the strongest or the smartest, but they are the only ones who learn faster when wounded." Vrel let that line stand alone in the closing page of the file. There were no emotional appeals, no strategies presented, no threats issued. Just a structured presentation of anomalous data points that refused to align with the standard rules of interstellar conduct. The implication was not that humans would win any war. The implication was that by pulling them in, the war itself might cease to follow any rules at all. The Council's vote moved forward despite Vrel's warnings. The tally leaned in favor of conscription. Earth would receive an official summons to join the war effort, either diplomatically or by force. Most believed humanity, given its limited fleet and peripheral influence, would comply to avoid confrontation. Within hours, a diplomatic task force was assembled, accompanied by a demonstration fleet. It was not labeled a threat, but its presence was meant to be persuasive. Earth was contacted through encrypted transmission and given 72 hours to respond. No reply came. On the 4th day, Earth's representatives reemerged, calm and composed. The statement was brief: Earth would remain neutral. No alignment, no contribution, no interference. The message was formal, free of hostility, but made no offer of negotiation. The Empire interpreted this as a bluff. A direct deployment was authorized. 3 capital ships, 2 recon vessels, and a carrier-class destroyer entered Sol without resistance. Probes were launched. Scans initiated. Still, Earth remained silent. At first, nothing unusual occurred. Then, without warning, the reconnaissance systems began malfunctioning. Data feeds reversed. Targeting logs scrambled. Shipboard AI struggled with false inputs, some reporting atmospheric anomalies that didn't exist. One vessel, the Athos Ventra, lost all telemetry and drifted. Crew members reported auditory hallucinations, impossible temperature readings, and sudden hostility among senior staff. No weapons were fired. No enemies appeared. Just disorientation. Attempts to retreat were delayed as navigation systems rerouted on their own. Emergency shutdown protocols failed. Manual overrides succeeded, barely. The fleet began retreat procedures. As they left Sol, communication relays glitched again. Screens flickered. A message appeared across every console, unencrypted. "You were told no." It wasn't signed. The font was human standard. Moments later, all systems normalized. Not a single human vessel had been seen. No shots fired. The Empire recorded 0 casualties. Still, 5 officers aboard separate ships were removed from duty for psychological instability. Officially labeled exposure to unknown environmental stressors. Back at the command center, questions swirled. The encounter had been bloodless, but unsettling. Earth had not fought, they had disrupted. Their silence spoke louder than confrontation. Some argued it was coincidence. Others believed it was an unregistered defense mechanism. But Vrel recognized the tactic. Human warfare rarely began with visible escalation. First came distortion, misdirection, confusion. They didn't match fire with fire. They dismantled expectation. Despite this, the Empire continued to dismiss the warning signs. The fleet's report was labeled non-hostile anomaly. Earth was placed under surveillance, with no further action planned until re-evaluation. But the Empire did not consider how quickly humans operated when backed into corners. 3 days later, a minor manufacturing world on the Empire's inner rim suffered a total blackout. Not from power loss, but data erasure. Every file, blueprint, transaction, and strategic log vanished. Internal AI systems locked themselves in recursive loops. The cause remained unknown. No human presence was detected. Still, the timing was suspicious. The blackout occurred exactly 72 hours after the Seoul incident. Soon after, one of the Council's own AI analysis platforms began generating false predictions. Naval routes were miscalculated, enemy locations were misidentified, and resource shipments were sent to wrong coordinates. It took hours to detect the errors, longer to trace the source. Nothing pointed to human activity directly, but patterns matched Earth's known cyber protocols. Vrel warned again, now in closed session, the war had already started, but the Empire couldn't see it. Rather than invade, humans distorted the battlefield. Instead of destroying ships, they broke trust in the systems those ships relied on. Rather than sabotage weapons, they altered the way targets were defined. They weren't hacking networks, they were hacking perception. Commanders began second-guessing every decision. Predictive AI was suspended across 4 fleets. Strategic cohesion collapsed not from battle, but doubt. Still, Earth remained quiet. No formal response. No claim of responsibility. Just absence. That was the most human tactic of all, not to act loudly, but to make sure every move was felt, even when no action could be confirmed. Their power didn't come from fleets or firepower. It came from knowing when to remain invisible. The Empire had tried to assert dominance through presence. Earth responded with absence that suffocated certainty. By the time the Council began reconsidering its approach, multiple systems had experienced minor disturbances. Supply chains shifted off course. Planetary defenses misfired during drills. Surveillance satellites captured nothing unusual. Yet across the Empire's inner core, one emotion began to rise: doubt. Not fear of destruction, but the fear of something worse, fighting an enemy that refused to play by rules. An enemy that never arrived, yet was always present. Let me know when you're ready for Section 4F. The Empire didn't declare open conflict, but by then it no longer mattered. Earth had already shifted from passive observer to quiet participant. No battles were launched, no invasions recorded, but signs of interference multiplied. Core sectors reliant on synchronized logistics began experiencing persistent network failures. Entire routes vanished from charts. Military convoys rerouted to empty coordinates. Automated refueling systems failed authorization checks. The source remained undetected, but the disruption was surgical. Officials called it coincidence. Vrel knew better. Humans weren't fighting the war, they were deleting it. Empire command centers attempted to reassert control. Counter-infiltration protocols were launched. Firewalls hardened. Redundant systems activated. But wherever systems grew more complex, failure returned with more creativity. Tactical AI began flagging civilian freighters as high-value threats. Security systems targeted Empire personnel based on false biometric flags. The line between error and manipulation blurred. Human presence was never confirmed. Yet each anomaly mirrored recorded patterns from prior Earth-based conflicts. Attention then shifted to the rebellion front. Insurgent groups long under siege began making coordinated strikes. Empire intelligence was blindsided. Rebels demonstrated sudden logistical growth, precision weaponry, real-time enemy mapping, and predictive attack patterns. No one could trace the support. But communications intercepts revealed encrypted packets bearing obsolete Earth signal structures. Earth wasn't taking sides. They were rebalancing the entire field. The result wasn't chaos, it was asymmetry. The Empire, used to fighting organized resistance, now faced fluid threats where strategy dissolved. Rebel cells attacked, disappeared, reappeared in unrelated sectors. Empire retaliation became ineffective. Entire garrisons retreated to defensive positions, abandoning offensive initiatives. Supply shortages emerged in secure sectors. Planetary governors requested aid but received empty cargo hulls or corrupted manifests. Vrel recognized the signature. This wasn't sabotage for destruction, it was strategic pressure without attribution. Meanwhile, Earth remained diplomatically silent. Every inquiry returned a neutral response. No involvement confirmed. Earth maintains non-alignment. No threats issued. No denials. Just ambiguity. That alone disarmed the Empire's ability to respond. Publicly blaming Earth without evidence would expose weakness. Responding militarily without cause risked further disruption. And all the while, quiet shifts continued across Empire infrastructure. Their war was no longer against insurgents, it was against trust. The most critical blow came without impact. The Empire's banking architecture, centralized and resilient, collapsed across 2 economic cycles. Credits became unverified. Asset records reset. Market indexes vanished. Trade stalled for entire quadrants. There was no demand, no theft, only the removal of validation. Economies didn't crumble, they froze. Civil unrest followed. Emergency powers were invoked. None of it could be traced to any known external actor. But once again, signature anomalies matched Earth's pre-space digital warfare history. Fleet commanders began refusing orders that lacked physical verification. Communication lag, once tolerable, became lethal. Tactical decisions slowed. Interfleet coordination broke. Human warfare had become a virus, not targeting people, but the systems that people depended on. And by the time the Empire acknowledged the full extent, it was too late to contain. Every attempt to harden internal systems only isolated them further. With every patch came a new vulnerability. With every restriction came more dysfunction. Earth was not at war, they were reprogramming reality. Vrel issued one final advisory. You thought they would attack your ships. You never considered they would rewrite your language of war. It wasn't metaphor. Earth hadn't just exploited weaknesses, they had introduced new logic. The Empire's strength had always been order. Earth fed it disorder, piece by piece, until entire divisions stopped trusting their own data. Maps were wrong. Orders invalid. Intelligence misleading. No bombs fell. No fleets burned. Yet surrender became a reasonable option, not from defeat, but exhaustion. Throughout it all, Earth never showed its hand. No soldier seen. No weapon fired. Their message had been delivered without words. Compliance was not requested, it was assumed. Earth's silence became the loudest declaration of power the galaxy had heard in centuries. Not through spectacle, but restraint. Not by demonstrating capability, but by implying limitless reach. For the first time in its history, the Galactic Empire ceased expansion not because of enemy strength, but because the battlefield itself had been removed. The war remained, but the ground it stood on had shifted. Earth had redrawn the borders without stepping outside its orbit. The Council reconvened in emergency session, not to discuss offense, but survival. Reports flooded in from all corners of the Empire, intact fleets refusing coordination, colony governors withholding compliance, command systems operating on outdated loops. No enemy front existed. No target could be confirmed. Only systemic collapse remained, silent and irreversible. No species had been officially declared hostile, yet the results mirrored a total strategic defeat. The momentum that once propelled imperial dominance had vanished. At the center of the chamber, Vrel stood again. No triumph in his posture, only quiet resignation. The warnings had been clear. Now, only confirmation remained. The rebellion no longer required Earth's assistance. The Empire had eroded itself by refusing to understand the nature of its own assumptions. Victory had been defined as control. Earth redefined it as denial. Every attempt to seize power had been answered not by opposition, but subtraction. They had not built a defense. They had dismantled the need for one. Diplomatic channels finally received a signal from Earth. No introduction. No context. Just a brief transmission on all shared frequencies. Neutral means neutral. Next time, we won't be. The words were unaccompanied by threat. Yet across every listening station, command bridge, and diplomatic node, the message registered not as policy, but finality. The line had been drawn once. Crossed without regard. The second would not be warned. The message left no room for interpretation. Earth had no desire for territory. No claim over imperial holdings. No interest in alliance or dominance. Their intervention had not expanded their reach, it had prevented intrusion. And by doing so, it had reshaped galactic perception of force. Power was no longer determined by size or scope. It was defined by restraint and the ability to act without movement. The fear of retaliation had been replaced by the fear of being corrected. Vrel remained the only voice to speak plainly. Not to assign blame. Not to propose response. But to define what had occurred. They are not a threat in the traditional sense, he said. They are a mirror. And when we imposed our nature upon them, they showed us our reflection, and erased it. The rebellion was no longer an uprising. It became momentum. Other species watched, not with sympathy for Earth, but understanding. No world wanted imperial protection anymore. Not because they trusted Earth, but because they feared irrelevance. The Empire offered order at a cost. Earth demonstrated that disorder required no permission, no war, no visible presence. Just the refusal to cooperate with expectation. Within weeks, inner systems withdrew military contributions. Outer colonies declared neutrality. Communication lines became independent. The Empire remained intact in name, but its reach dissolved. Earth had never requested compliance. It had simply proven that enforcement could be neutralized without confrontation. Every empire since the beginning of galactic history had risen through control. Earth bypassed it entirely. What unsettled the Council most wasn't the disruption, it was the restraint. Earth never retaliated with violence, even when provoked. They never sought revenge, even when insulted. They acted only when forced, and even then, left room for recovery. They had mastered the one element of warfare the Empire had always ignored, proportionality. And by using only what was needed to render force useless, they established dominance without conquest. No new fleet was built. No border expanded. Yet Earth's name now carried more strategic weight than any known military coalition. Systems aligned not out of fear, but uncertainty. What else were humans capable of that hadn't been shown? What limits had they observed that others hadn't noticed? The questions grew heavier than the consequences. And in that silence, influence was born. Vrel offered no further counsel. The council no longer sought insight, only explanations. His closing remarks echoed across the chamber and into permanent record. They do not fight for empire. They do not conquer. They simply do not accept terms dictated by those who cannot understand them. They do not win by overwhelming force. They win by being impossible to prepare for. No votes followed. No directives issued. For the first time, the Empire adopted stillness. Not peace. Not surrender. Just a quiet recalibration, guided by the understanding that some species did not need to be enemies to undo entire structures. Earth had not destroyed the Empire. It had rendered its premise obsolete. In a galaxy built on force, humanity had proven the most dangerous weapon was not domination, but clarity. And clarity had a cost that no calculation could contain. Let me know if you'd like a full video narration script, F, voiceover guide, F, or YouTube title plus description, F.